All right, this is the video for the 8th unit of the class, which is on public opinion. If you remember in one of the very first lectures of this summer, what I said was that American politics was about two types of questions: questions about institutions and questions about behavior. Now, when we focus on institutions, at this point, you should be hardwired to think immediately about things like Congress, the presidency, and the judiciary. We just wrapped up a series of units covering American institutions. The institutions are basically the halls and walls of government. You know how the rules of government work now. Now, in this last part of the class, we're going to move to addressing questions of political behavior. Questions of political behavior really span a lot of different issues, but today we're going to talk about public opinion, which is probably one of the first things folks think about when they think about political behavior. It's what people think about politics. But then in this second half of the class, we're also going to talk about elections, political parties, interest groups, media, and we'll wrap up by talking about state and local politics, which is kind of separate from behavior. The discipline of political science has evolved from first addressing questions about institutions to now being more about political behavior. It's been a natural evolution because when you think about politics, you really first think about what the rules are. After decades of studying the institutions of government, political scientists have now moved to the harder task of discussing what citizens believe, think, act, and actually do. And now that we're moving on to behavior, there's a couple of things that you should be thinking about in the sense that we're really moving the bar in terms of what we're focusing on in this class. It's no longer about the rules, but basically how people react to these rules. So as we move forward in the second part of the class, you really want to think about how individuals, how people, how citizens respond to the institutions of government, and what kind of problems do American institutions create in this democratic experiment. And can we categorize and systematically examine behavior? Think about it, even before I get into any of these topics, if I'm setting out to describe human behavior, that's a monumentally difficult task. And that's part of the difficulty with these last set of lectures, that it's just really hard to figure out what people think, how people act, and what people are going to do. And today we're going to talk first about public opinion. And in public opinion, we're going to address a lot of things, but one of the things that we'll end up on is whether or not American opinion can actually be heard within the walls of government. People believe a certain set of opinions on a set of political issues, but the real question to ask yourself is, do those opinions actually get heard? And it might be the case that they do sometimes, but another better question is, should these opinions be heard in the walls of government? And hopefully you'll get a better sense of that as we move through these four topics. The very first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to explain what is a public opinion. So it's good to kind of set the stage and really define public opinion so we can walk before we run. The second thing that I'm going to do is talk about polls. And the textbook does a really excellent job, actually, of covering polls and how to read them, but also the scientific aspects of them. I'm going to really just focus on one aspect of this, which is the wording behind polls, and hopefully that'll give you sort of a way to estimate how you should read these polls as a news consumer, either in newspapers or even on television. The third thing that I'll talk about is political knowledge. It's a remarkably important conversation. Part of what people think about politics is their thoughts or their knowledge of political facts. And this conversation is kind of a linchpin in a lot of things that we'll talk about for the rest of the summer. So it's an important conversation. And the fourth part of the class ends with a note on representation. And the fourth part kind of refers back to things that we're going to talk about, especially for the paper that's coming up in a couple days. So let's just jump right in and talk about part one of the class, which is what is public opinion. So public opinion refers to citizen attitudes about really any political issue, leader, events, or institution. So if I was thinking about people's attitudes towards all these different things, well, it could be your attitude towards something like immigration or the economy. It could be about leaders, right? So Donald Trump, Beto O'Rourke, Kamala Harris, or even someone more local like Norma Torres. What about institutions? So what are your opinions or attitudes towards things like Congress, the presidency, the judiciary? And one of the things to think about as we move through public opinion is that we can examine attitudes individually, of course. Every person in the class is going to have some sort of attitude about politics, and even not really caring, that's an attitude. But most of your attitudes come from the result of your lives, your backgrounds, your upbringing, your education, or even your income. But at the same time that we can examine attitudes individually, we can also examine attitudes collectively. So we can kind of assess the opinions of the class as a whole. I can take a poll of the class. I can assess the opinions of the university. I can take a poll of the university, and then it can just and that can just be broader and broader, right? So public opinion exists on a number of different levels. It's not just about what you yourself believe. It's about what the country believes and the implications of those beliefs. Public opinion is important for a variety of different reasons. Elected officials, of course, are going to look at public opinion. There's lots of excellent examples in American history where politicians do things because they believe the public is behind them. Second, the media is reporting consistently on public opinion polls, and this drives not only elected officials, but changes policies in the way that they're made in this country. The textbook did a really good job of focusing on the horse race coverage of polling, and that is definitely an important part of this conversation. One of the things that we'll jump into when we're talking about knowledge is, what if public opinion is misinformed? If the public believes a set of issues that are just fundamentally wrong about how politics really works, then the effect of that potentially is that we might have misinformed policies. So public opinion is important for a lot of reasons, but one of the reasons is that we need to make sure that the public is adequately educated. And lastly, which kind of goes into the broader themes of the class where we talk about oligarchy and elites, public opinion can definitely be influenced by elites. And it's difficult to think of what we mean by elite sometimes because we use that term so sparingly. But elites can refer to anybody that has a presence in society, whether that be a media presence, political presence, or even a presence more officially. So how do these elites, the media, politicians, corporations, influence public opinion? So that's all important elements of this conversation to consider before we kind of jump in further. One of the things I want to talk about next is where your opinions come from. Now, we arrive at opinions in very specific ways, and this kind of begins to skim the surface of political psychology. The fundamental processes of why people make specific choices or decisions or have opinions is all what psychology does, right? It's the study of the brain. And psychology is interesting because it really informs political science on public opinion. And we know from psychological studies that people's opinions come from two cornerstones. And this is something that the book definitely talks about. First, you have beliefs. And your beliefs should be thought of as basically information about objects. But these thoughts about objects reflect what people think to be true about the world. These are your assumptions and convictions about how objects work, but how the world works, right? Because the world is filled with objects. So, for example, some of our beliefs or assumptions or convictions about the way the world works are scientific in nature. We all assume gravity is there, right? We can't see gravity, but gravity will always pull down an object that I throw in the air. And we continue to kind of live our lives with that expectation that gravity is going to do its job. That's an assumption. We have assumptions about politics. And some assumptions about politics tend to be fairly negative. For example, in politics, we always tend to believe that given the chance, people are going to take advantage of a situation. And that kind of drives people's maybe motives in dealing not only with legislators, but just as citizens as well when we're dealing with politics. But more specifically speaking, in regards to politics, some of these assumptions and convictions about the world can inform our issue positions. So in terms of crime and punishment, some folks believe it's their assumption that nonviolent punishments are actually better at deterring people from committing serious crimes. So our beliefs are basically just our thoughts about how the world works, about how the objects of the world are going to come together to kind of form our lives. And we have different beliefs. We have different assumptions about the world, right? People have these beliefs based on information that's relevant to their lives, their upbringings, but their day-to-day lives as well. But these beliefs, these assumptions structure how the world works. And in politics, you should think of this as our assumptions about how politics works. Second, as comprising your opinions, values refer to someone's ideals. And this is a normative belief. And when we say normative, it's kind of a socially constructed preference. Now, we've talked about values in this class before. In one of the very first lectures, I highlighted political values. And these are examples, right? So freedom, order, and equality are definitely normative beliefs about how society should work, right? These are values that people find to be important in specific regard to politics. We have different opinions about how these values should be structured. And it can be more simple than these kind of broader range values like freedom, order, and equality. Your values can be something like a mantra, so to speak. If you believe that you should treat others the way you want to be treated, that is in itself a value, right? And that value might get at a deeper sense of equality, but nonetheless, we learn values from people throughout our lives, not just our parents, mostly from our parents, but our values kind of structure our thoughts, our opinions about how the world should work. So your values definitely have an effect on politics, right? Because your preferences on things like freedom, order, and equality will structure your issue positions on things, but definitely more simple ideas you have about how the world should work, conventions that people should live their lives by, are definitely influencing what you think about politics. So at this point, right, I've only explained beliefs and values that you see here on the screen. And the way that this works with public opinion specifically is that we take our beliefs about how the world works and we kind of mesh that in with the values in which we think the world should work by to develop both attitudes and opinions. So first I'm going to talk about an opinion. And an opinion is an outward expression of support or opposition towards objects. And of course, with public opinion in this class, you should think of this as an outward expression of support or opposition toward a political object. And your opinions are arguably somewhat observable, and this is what we measure in political science. We try to measure all the time what people believe about politics. And your opinion can be measured in a lot of different ways. One of the most simple ways is a vote for a candidate, right? That's your opinion of who you think should win in an election. But you can also make a statement in person about liking or disliking a candidate. That is also observable, right? It's an attitude. It's an outward expression of a political object. Signing a petition is an outward expression of a political object. Going to a rally, donating money, right? So these forms of participation, your express support or opposition for a candidate or a position, that definitely kind of gets at your opinions. Attitudes are a little different. So attitudes or opinions are external. Attitudes are more internal. Attitudes are a psychological tendency that is expressed by evaluating some sort of object with a degree of favor or disfavor. So this is something that's happening in your brain. And I would think about your attitude as kind of a feeling, an emotion about a political object. And this, of course, can be a person, and it definitely can be an issue. So your internal feelings about politics, liking someone like Pete Buttigieg or the NRA or Congress, or hating the idea of Barack Obama as president, or thinking feminists are doing a good job of advancing feminist rights. These are all attitudes, right? Because these are internal ideas or emotions about what you think about politics. So your beliefs, your values structure your internal and external feelings about politics. So although this might seem a little bit complicated, this equation that you see on the screen really isn't so much. There isn't really that much written into this. And the very last part of this first section of the class, where I talk about what is public opinion, I do want to mention something that the textbook talks about, which is political socialization. And this is this idea that our beliefs and values are not sporadic, right? They just don't appear out of nowhere. Our beliefs and the values are taught to us. So one of the things to think about in American politics, especially in regard to mass polarization, that we're increasingly being split by political party, that people are becoming more Democrat or more Republican, is that your beliefs and values are learned from your family mostly. And we know this in political science. We've done a long series of research trying to kind of get at why people express the opinions and attitudes that they do. And we know that family, what your parents believe politically, is transferred to children quite readily. That it's the case that if your parents are both Republicans, you will most likely identify as a Republican as an adult and for your entire life. So family socialization is a really important force in politics. So we might not be all that different. It's just that we're kind of expressing these ideas that we've learned from our early lives. You also can be socialized by a number of different forces. Your friends, for example, is somewhat influential. Maybe your friends are really into politics and you kind of follow that as well, and that might change your ideas about politics. Friends are more influential for cultural influences. So your music or the films you watch, that's more likely that your friends will be influential more in that regard. Media is a strong socialization force. So we consume media at a pretty steady rate in our lives, but we definitely use media to kind of think about politics, and it kind of shapes our opinions about politics as well. So if you are an avid Fox News watcher, it's more than likely the case that you're going to be a supporter of the Republican Party. Education is also a socialization force. It's a source of your political opinions. So we know throughout research that the more educated you become, the more liberal you become. Now that can start a series of conversations about the nature of a college education or even advanced degrees, especially for folks in the engineering and sciences. You know that most of your coursework really isn't political in nature. It might be the fact that most of your professors are liberal, but how often do your professors tend to espouse liberal ideologies in your engineering and science classes? It's rare, but there is this widespread argument being made by people on the right that says that education is kind of this liberal socializing force. And it's true, but it's not this active political move on behalf of liberals. Liberals aren't necessarily trying to liberalize, drive people further left through education. Again, super interesting, but it's a conversation probably for another lecture. So at the very end, right, we have these opinions and attitudes, but they're coming from specific places, mostly your parents, but there's other sources of socialization that we should also be aware about. In the second part of the class, I'm going to move to talking about what we call polling public opinion. So I've established really broadly that public opinion are our beliefs and values about the political world. So this section pretty much examines how we measure or poll public opinion in the United States. We have over 300 million people in this country, and we constantly are polling the public on what they believe about politics. Now, it doesn't even have to be about politics. You can poll people on whatever you want. You can ask them what they're going to have for dinner tonight. However, polling happens about everything, right? Marketing is a big part of this country, consumerism. So polling is consistent across American life, but it's also a matter of resources if you want to do it correctly. So if you are trying to do a poll in the right way, you should have both money and the expertise behind it. There are many ways to conduct polls. So typically people think about this now as kind of doing online surveys, but you can do polls by calling people on the phone, going door to door, interviewing folks one-on-one, or even mailing them a questionnaire. And it doesn't matter what form it is. The most important thing to mention when we talk about polling public opinion is it's important to examine the fine print. And one of the most fundamental things about any poll that claims to assess the opinions of the country is that you have to make sure that the poll is what we call a random sample. So random sample is that every person in the electorate has an equal probability of being included in that poll. Now you might think, well, Professor, how do you actually make a random sample of over 300 million people? Do we know that every single person in the country is going to have an equal probability of being selected as a respondent for your poll? Well, that's a good question. And the way that this is done is actually just by randomly calling telephone numbers. It's assumed that every person in the United States has a phone, so if we randomly call telephone numbers across the country, arguably we should get a pretty random representation. Now, there are problems with this assumption because, one, not every person has a phone, two, people have multiple phones, and three, you want to make sure that these phone numbers are aggregated around the country in a representative fashion. And it used to be the case that people had a phone number based on their area code, which was more regional in the past couple decades, but is now changing with cell phones. So there are scientific means to kind of assess how representative your poll is. But first and foremost, without getting into the nitty-gritty of all this, it's really about having a random sample. You also want to look at other things. So if the poll in the fine print says that it's random, that should be your green light. You're okay, I can trust the results of this poll. But you also want to look at the credibility of the source. So the organization who sponsored the polls tends to be important. Now, I mentioned that you need money to conduct polls, and to conduct polls very frequently, right? It costs a lot of money to call people at home and to have most of them hang up on you, actually. But media organizations now are the organizations who sponsor these polls. But most of the polls that we see out in the wild actually don't even have a sponsor or organization tied to it. So, for example, one of the things that the media often reports on are healthcare studies. The latest study that says you can now drink 6 cups of coffee instead of 3 because it's still good for your heart. Now, to a certain extent, I would say that some of those healthcare studies are accurate and conducted by universities with great reputations, but it might be the case that those studies might be put out by maybe a coffee company. You just don't know. So you want to look at the organization who's sponsoring whatever it is that's put out there. And then this leads to just more fine print about, exactly who's the population that they're hoping to select, what's the questions that they asked, what's the response rate. So less than 10% of the polls that you'll see out there actually have a complete methodology profile that will tell you all this information. If they do, then that's probably a great sign that you can trust the poll. But if they don't, or if they don't take the time to put that information up there for you, then you probably want to be more skeptical. First and foremost, I would underscore and highlight the fact that the American public is captivated by public opinion polls, and captivated because, especially in politics, we're constantly focused on the results of an election or the results of an upcoming election. You'll see this in presidential elections, especially. So, that being said, we need to be more critical of how we're reading into these polling numbers, and most Americans are not. And I've kind of jumped in briefly to talking about the scientific aspect of polling, but I'm just going to really focus on one element of polling, and that's just the kinds of questions that we ask. So I'm going to run through a short number of examples where we're going to cover how wording of the questions really radically affects the responses that you're going to get from the electorate. So I'm going to start with an example in the 1990s, and that's Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton was accused of lying under oath about his affair with former White House intern Monica Lewinsky. During his administration, his second term in office, Republicans in the House of Representatives moved to impeach him. Most of you probably weren't paying attention to politics at that time, but nonetheless, it's reminiscent of the kind of thing that's happening right now to Donald Trump in this conversation about whether or not the House of Representatives will impeach him. So the way that impeachment works is that it starts in the House, and the House, if the majority agree, will impeach a president, which means not that he's removed from office, but then that he's put on trial in the Senate. The Senate will then have hearings around the impeachment charges, and if the Senate agrees after the result of these hearings, will vote to remove or keep the president in office. So when it came to light that Bill Clinton had this improper affair and lied under oath about the affair, that's really what this issue was, is that this president was lying under oath, which is illegal. There was these organizations that were putting out polls about whether or not Bill Clinton should basically resign before he was impeached. So here's one version of a poll that was put out. Should Bill Clinton resign if he were impeached, or should he fight the charges in the Senate? So at this point, with this particular wording, when posed to a random representative sample of the American public, 59% said that he should resign, and 41% say that he should fight the charges. Now, if you just saw this maybe like on the cover of a newspaper or on the nightly network news, you might think, wow, the public opinion is stacked against Bill Clinton, right? Like he should probably just throw in the towel, because this is a pretty healthy majority, so around 60% saying that he should leave office, even leave office before the Senate has a chance to even vote. Now, part of this is that you just want to be real critical of the wording. The wording here has kind of a framing where Bill Clinton is getting prepared to fight in the Senate. Now, there's a lot of things that we think about politics, but one of them is that people don't like it when folks fight. So if this question has the word fight the charges in the poll, then people are going to be less optimized to select that, because they just don't want to see political fights happen, and they know that it's going to take months. It'll be sprawled out on the news every night. It'll be taking up all the newspaper coverage. So only 41% say that he should fight. So there's ways that you can ask this question that will change people's opinions, and it's basically asking the same thing. So another version of this question is, should Bill Clinton resign, or should he remain in office to face trial in the Senate? Now, this question is not framed in this kind of negative aspect of politics where Bill Clinton is going to get up and fight in the Senate, that he's going to be he's just going to kind of stay there and face trial, right? It's just a much more neutral wording in this second version. So remember that we had around 60% of people saying that he should resign. However, when we ask this question in the way where it's just Bill Clinton remaining in office to face trial, 43% say that he should resign. So it changes dramatically. And in this case, if you were Bill Clinton and you were looking at these poll numbers, you would be like, oh, okay, I'm going to stay in office because I'm going to win this thing, right? If you have the support of the American people who don't want you to resign, at least a majority, then you're probably going to stay and face trial in the Senate. Most Americans don't think that critically about polls, right? I mean, most Americans aren't really sitting there with the fine-tooth comb and kind of poring over word choice and how that's going to affect the respondents. However, if you're not a reputable organization and you have kind of a bias in seeing the numbers kind of play out in a certain way, there's certain ways that you can write these questions which seem fairly innocuous, but could definitely alter the results of what people are saying. I'm going to take a step back and show you a more serious example of how you can really alter people's answers to polls. And it's not going to be a political question, but this is a real-life psychological experiment that folks did. And I say psychological, I mean people, psychology professors did this because they wanted to show that the question wording really affects people's responses on polls, just like the one that we have with Bill Clinton here. So we're going to change gears, and now I'm going to talk about another poll. So this is dealing with the virus. So a virus affects 600 people, and scientists have found two anecdotes that will save people's lives. If we choose liquid 1 of these 600, 200 people will be saved. But if we choose liquid 2, there's a 1/3 probability that 600 people will be saved, but a 2/3 probability that no one will be saved. Which do you choose? So in this instance, psychology professors actually gave this poll to a random set of respondents across the country because they just wanted to see how people would respond to different wording. So in this first version of the poll, 72% of the public chose liquid 1, that they would save 200 people. And only 28% of the public chose liquid 2, where they would like to take that risk of saving everyone, but there's this stronger probability that nobody would be saved. Now, keep this in the back of your mind, right? Internalize this, because what I'm going to do next is I'm going to show you a different way that we can ask this question. And this is the second way that the psychology professors pose this question. So a virus affects 600 people, and scientists have found 2 anecdotes. So it starts off the same way. If we choose liquid 1, 400 people will die. If we choose liquid 2, there is a 1/3 probability that no one will die, but a 2/3 probability that all 600 will die. Which do you choose? So if you remember, liquid 1 won last time, right? Liquid 1 had 72% of the public, but this time liquid 2 is the winner, where 78% of the public selects this option where they're willing to risk more to save everybody. Now, one thing that's really neat about this experiment in polling is that the 2 versions of this virus question are exactly the same. So on the screen right now, you see this version that's kind of framed in the terminology of people dying, right? In liquid 1, 400 people will die. If we choose liquid 2, there's a 1/3 probability that no one will die. So I'm going to flash back really quickly to the first version to show you that they're the same exact thing. They're just framed and worded in different terms. So if I go back to the first version, liquid 1, right, and it changes from 400 people will die to 200 people will be saved. So in this first version, we're actually framing things in terms of saving people's lives, right? And when we frame things as saving people's lives, people are more likely to choose liquid 1. And that's because when you're talking about saving people's lives, you're more risk averse, and you just don't want to kind of risk it, right? You don't want to have this 2/3 probability that nobody's life is going to be safe. But then if we switch to the second version again, where we frame things instead of people dying, we are more willing to take this risk because just because of the fact that we are so scared of death, right? Liquid 2 is the clear winner here. We're willing to take this much bigger risk, which is the same risk in the first version, but that's because people don't like death, right? They're likely to kind of jump into this risk if death is really what's being talked about here. So with both these examples, with Bill Clinton and this virus, the fundamental point is that the wording of the polls are extremely important. And if you're not really careful in reading what's being asked on these public opinion polls, even something as simple as who are you going to vote for president, right? You just have to be more critical and have a real discerning eye behind what's being shown. Then you're probably doing yourself a disservice if you're not. The wording, the scientific method, the by which the poll is conducted, and of course, the way that it was sampled, and hopefully it was sampled randomly if it's claiming to be a nationally representative poll. So that's a little neat conversation to kind of look more critically at public opinion polling, especially because the country tends to be so focused on these polls on a day-to-day basis. So in this third part of the video, what I'm going to do is I'm going to really unpack this whole conversation about political knowledge. Now, you might ask yourself, well, why are we talking about political knowledge in a lecture that's supposed to be mostly about polling? Well, you can poll people on what they know about politics. And in a broader sense, political knowledge is more important just because of the implications that it carries in terms of how society is either knowledgeable or unknowledgeable. If you ask yourself the question, if I were going to assume that the American public is one way or the other, knowledgeable or unknowledgeable, you probably would say that most Americans don't know that much about politics, right? And that's kind of the punchline of this part of the video, is that once you see all the data that I'm going to show you in a second, most people don't know that much about American politics. And there's lots of reasons for that. Most people are turned off by politics. Most people don't like talking about it in public forums. Most people think of politics as being kind of a dirty or crooked business. But more important than why is the question of what happens after. What is the effect of having a society that's remarkably unknowledgeable politically? And it's an important conversation to have, because we do consider ourselves to be a democratic republic, right? We are a system which prides ourselves on having a government by the people, for the people. But the fact that we as a society are not knowledgeable enough to make adequate choices about our representatives carries serious implications about American politics. And it's part of the reason why we are taken advantage of as citizens, right? So if you're making an argument for an oligarchy, or if you're making an argument that American consumerism is bad, it's really underscored by this idea that the American electorate is remarkably unknowledgeable, easily manipulated by elites. And in practice, the policy that ends up being implemented really hurts the American public. So our complaints about government perhaps are deaf to a more serious criticism of ourselves, right? Part of the reason why politics is so bad is because we as citizens allow it to be. We as citizens are not only indifferent or maybe even hate politics, but we're also ignorant to politics. So more than taking kind of this broader ideological or normative conversation about these implications, I'm going to kind of boil this down really simply, right? And on the screen, you see a definition of political knowledge. Political knowledge is known as basically facts that you know about politics. And this can include things like the people, the elected officials, our institutions, so government, Congress, presidency, judiciary, but even on the local or state level. And then your knowledge about issues. So Americans are actually expected to know quite a bit about politics in terms of being participatory in American government. In order to vote in a really efficient and correct way, you need to know a lot about who's running, what they're running for, and what they're running on, right? These are the figures, the institutions, and issues. Now, it tends to be the case, because this is too much for the American public, that political knowledge is really low. And there's been a lot of research in this in political science. There have been books written on this. There's been polls that have been conducted time and time again about political knowledge. In fact, whenever you see any kind of political science data from the American public, they'll always ask political knowledge questions. Researchers want to know, even if your study is not about knowledge, how knowledgeable is this sample that you're contacting? So the rest of the information in this part of the class, third part of the class, is going to come from a study from the Pew Center. And the Pew Center is this independent research tank in Washington, D.C. They do lots of different studies on politics, and I'm just going to jump right into it to show you what people know about politics, which is not very much. So this first graph shows you the percentage of people in the United States who can name the following. So they basically ask, who is your vice president? Who is your governor? Who is the president of Russia? So on and so forth. And what you see is that, these are pretty basic questions in some regard. The vice president, for example, only 69% of the American electorate can name the vice president. There might be some of you in this class who don't know who the vice president of the United States is. It's Mike Pence. But nonetheless, right, that's bad. We should know who one of the most prominent office holders in this country is. There's actually a small, tiny, minuscule percentage of people who don't know who the U.S. president is, and it's like less than 1%, but there are people in America who don't know that. I suspect with Donald Trump, the percentage is a little bit higher, and there's very few people who don't know who that is. But especially in prior administrations where the president was kind of just running things as is, there was definitely people who didn't know who was sitting in office. But even as you move to the right of this graph, you see some figures here. The status of the U.S. trade deficit. Only 68% of people can name that, which is actually, I think, is pretty impressive. The fact that we have a deficit is kind of complicated. People are not thinking that much about the economy or how much money the government is spending. Another one here that's really difficult, the ideology of the Chief Justice. Now, that is kind of crazy difficult to answer. The Chief Justice of the United States, I've mentioned before in this class, is John Roberts. He's more conservative to the right. So only 37% of people can correctly name that. Speaker of the House, only approximately half of the public. So this was done in 2007. I suspect now, because Nancy Pelosi takes a prominent opposition role towards Donald Trump, that percentage will be higher. Also, she's the only woman to ever hold Speaker of the House, so she's just more prominent in that regard. Secretary of Defense, only 21% of people can name that. Right, so some of these are really basic, some of these are more complicated, but the idea, no matter what, is that people don't know that much. If we focus on political figures specifically, so do you know who this person is? Now, this is an interesting list because it's mixed in with pop culture figures and celebrities, so it's not just politicians. The first person you see on the screen is kind of a hybrid, right? Arnold Schwarzenegger is both an actor, but he was also the former governor of California in the 2000s. So 93% of the American public knew who he was. 93% of the public recognized Hillary Clinton. 65% of the American public recognized Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State for George W. Bush at the time. Some of you probably don't know who that is. Beyonce in 2007 only had a 64% name recognition. Suspect that'll be a little bit higher around a decade later. Peyton Manning, 62%. Barack Obama, before he became president, a year before he became president, only 61% of the public knew who he was, which I think is pretty alarming. But it shows you the extent to which most people don't follow politics closely. If I keep moving through this list, you see Nancy Pelosi, Louis Scooter Libby, and then it just gets to be, who are these people? Robert Gates, Harry Reid, right? And this begins to drop precipitously. Harry Reid used to be the Senate Majority Leader, but only 15% could actually name him or knew who he was. Now, one area that I do want to focus on now is explaining the why, right? So the why is something that I did mention a couple minutes ago. As I said, don't really focus too much yet, but let's talk about the why, and then at the end I'll come back to the implications of the importance of the political knowledge being so low in the United States. But first, let's get to the reasons why this actually is the case. So I'm going to show you some more data, but now it's basically data that show you how demographics exist on knowledge levels, how demographics affects how much you know about politics. So very first thing is, let's look at the effect of education on political knowledge, right? The more you're educated, the longer that you're in school, it's going to be more likely the case that you have a higher level of political knowledge. So if you go to college, for example, you're forced to take a class like PLS 201, where you're going to be learning about institutions, figures, and issues. So you're going to develop more knowledge about politics. So the way to look at this graph on the screen is that people in the country are split into three categories of knowledge: those who are low knowledge, medium knowledge, and high knowledge. So it tends to be the case that most people in the country are low knowledge. So let's focus first there. So of people who are characterized as having relatively low levels of political knowledge, yeah, of course, right? 49% of them, almost a majority, have a high school diploma or less. And then if you have some college education, 31% of those people tend to be low knowledge, and 11% of people in the low knowledge category tend to have a college degree. If I jump to the high knowledge category on the other side, on the right side of the graph, people in society that are really knowledgeable about politics, almost a majority, it's a really nice graph. Again, 49% of them have a college degree. 31% have some college, and only 20% have a high school diploma. So education is really important. It tends to spur the development of political knowledge. But the story doesn't end there, right? This is kind of intuitive. We know that education is going to change political knowledge levels. But what about something like gender, right? I'm going to do the same thing. Look at low knowledge and high knowledge categories. Of folks who are low knowledge, 42% of them are women, and 26% of them are men. On the high knowledge side, the way that you should read this is 42% of women find themselves in the low knowledge category, whereas 26% of men find themselves in the low knowledge category. On the opposite side of the graph, people that are very knowledgeable, 45% of men find themselves in that category, but only 25% of women find themselves in that category. So the difference is remarkably stark, right? It tends to be the case that men are more likely to be politically knowledgeable. Again, lots of reasons for this, and this is a little bit more complicated than education's effect on political knowledge, but we tend to know that politics tends to be a fairly male-oriented sport, so to speak. And I say this because who are our politicians? They tend to be mostly men. Our politicians at the national legislature, by far a majority are men, and they've been men throughout history. So when we learn about this stuff in the textbooks, it's from the perspective of men and not women. And it's been only relatively recent that women have had a role in national politics by taking and getting elected to Congress. But throughout history, right, women didn't get the right to vote until 1919. So it's something that still has ramifications today in terms of how readily women are ready to take on or are just interested in politics. Next, let's talk about age. So if we look at age groups across both low and high knowledge categories, of those that are low knowledge, 56% of people who are 18 to 29 find themselves in that category. So it tends to be the case that young people are pretty unknowledgeable about politics. Not surprising. And I want to spend a moment here talking about young people before I kind of get into other aspects of this graph. Young people have relatively little time on this earth. And in reality, if you think about it, most young people are not really plugged into these kinds of ideas until they're at least 15, 16. And you're not really getting real exposure to politics in an official way till you're 17, 18. You're registering to vote, joining the military, or starting to do things like just adult to get a job, right? So that tends to be the case why people who are 18 to 29 are pretty unknowledgeable about politics. 15% of young people find themselves in that high range category. But I'm going to flip this on the other side now, and I'm going to look at older folks. And these are folks who are 65 and older. So this is a yellow bar. Of those folks who are 65 and older, 43% of them find themselves in the high knowledge category. And at this time, right, when you're 65 and older, you've lived a life. You've probably bought a house, you've gotten married, you have kids. Now, how is that relevant to politics and knowledge? Well, as you get older, you're kind of forced to interact more with politics, right? You get a job, you start paying taxes, you get married, you file jointly, you buy a house, you get government benefits for getting married and buying a house. You have kids, your kids go to public schools, right? So all of this stuff is just mired in politics, and you're not doing this when you're 18 to 29, especially these days, right? But when you're 65 and older, you are doing this, and by virtue of just having lived your life, you're kind of getting more exposure to politics and learning more about it. So that's why that people who tend to be 65 and older find themselves more in the high knowledge category than those who are 18 to 29. Now, one thing to note before I move on to the next slide is that people who are 50 to 64, that gray bar, they're actually more knowledgeable than their older counterparts. And that's just something really interesting to point out, because there tends to be kind of a drop-off, right? Your cognitive ability to kind of remain plugged in or learn about politics just diminishes, and that's because your mental capacities, even your physical capacities, the ability to do things like read, write, and withstand politics by sitting there and reading or listening or watching it diminishes as you get older. So you do see a drop off there. Let's talk next about the effect of race on political knowledge. So this is not a very extensive graph. It only shows the difference between white people and black people on knowledge levels. But focusing on the low knowledge category, only 31% of white people find themselves as being knowledgeable about politics, but 44% of black people find themselves in that category. On the flip side, in high participation rate, 37% of people find themselves, of white people find themselves in the very knowledgeable category of politics, where it's only 24% of black individuals. Now, this has a lot to do with history and institutional power and your ability to kind of see yourself represented in the institutions of politics. I said this really briefly when I discussed gender, in that women have just recently been part of the political system. And it wasn't really until the 1960s that African Americans, for the first time, had a real credible shot at being involved in things like just voting. And even today, with strict registration requirements, underrepresented people have a much more difficult time in doing things like voting, participating, as compared to white people, right? It's a system that's made for certain folks versus others. And that does have an effect on basically how willing you are to kind of stay plugged into the system and know more about it. So here you definitely see that there are distinct differences between white and black individuals in terms of what they know about politics. This is the last graph that I want to show you about demographics, and this is on income, right? So this is a really good conversation to have in reference to the oligarchy, in reference to elites, in reference to even the hold that American consumerism has on us. The rich know a lot about politics, and the rich are the ones that really kind of control politics. So in this graph, let's just focus first on the rich. So these are people that earn over $100,000. They're on the furthest right, green bar. If you earn more than $100,000, there's a 55% likelihood that you're going to be very knowledgeable about politics. There's a reason for this, right? Your money is going to be under threat for government, and you want to protect your money from government. This is why rich people don't like taxes. This is why rich people like policies that benefit them but hurt maybe the middle class, right? So you have to be plugged into the system to ensure that your money is going to be protected, and it's pretty unlikely that you're going to be unknowledgeable about politics. Only 16% of people who make $100,000 or more find themselves in that low knowledge category. But look what happens when you make less than $20,000, right? That you're living under the poverty line. 60% of those folks, this blue bar all the way on the left, find themselves in the low knowledge category. Only 14% of them find themselves in the high knowledge category, right? So this is really the underpinnings of the oligarchical system that this country faces, right? That the people that are making the choices, the decisions for society, are the elites, right? So this is the why, right? Income, but race, age, gender, and education are all kind of reasons why knowledge levels tend to be low, right? Power tends to be concentrated in the hands of those who know the most, and those who know the most are the people that have been running this country for years and years and years. One last note before I wrap up this part 3 of the class is that this has strong implications on civic engagement. So civic engagement is kind of one of the main themes of the class, right? One of the reasons why you take this class is because you want to make sure that you're plugged in, you know the importance of civic engagement, that you are knowledgeable, that if you're a citizen, you're doing things like voting, participating, and just making sure that you have a stake in the process. So I'm going to show you one last bit of data on the next slide, but this last data shows you why it's important to have a class like PLS 201 that's going to increase your levels of political knowledge. You are undoubtedly learning facts in this class. It's an online class. It goes by really quickly. You might be grudgingly taking this course, but at the same time, you're probably going to remember things from this class, and you'll remember things that you'll take on for the rest of your life, because politics is in your face for the rest of your life. You'll remember back randomly years from now and remember, oh, I remember that online class talked about this a little bit. So on this screen, what this shows you on the horizontal x-axis on the bottom is people's score on a knowledge quiz. So in this study, they issued a 10-question quiz on politics. If you got all 10 questions correct, you got a score of 10. If you got 0 questions correct, you got a score of 0, right? So the more questions you answer correctly, the higher knowledgeable you are. But on this line graph, you see that they correlate this with forms of participation. Voting, which is the most basic thing that you can do, right? Of all the things that you can do in politics, voting is the easiest, but also contributing money. And then it has this real general catch-all category, other forms of participation. So what does that orange line mean? Well, you can do things like put a bumper sticker on your car, attend a political rally, sign a petition, boycott a company for political reasons, right? So there's tons of ways that you can participate other than voting or donating money. Voting is the easiest. Donating money is the hardest because you have to have that discretionary income in order to donate to a candidate who you like. All right, so now we're ready to kind of interpret the effects of knowledge, because what you see on the bottom of the screen, right, is that as you increase a knowledge score, you are more likely to do these three things. You are more likely to, in the gray line, vote. You're more likely to, in the blue line, contribute money. And you are more likely in the orange line to participate in these other forms. So for those who score a 10 out of 10 on this knowledge score, there's an 84% likelihood that you will vote. Now you might ask yourself, well, that's not really that high. It should be much higher than that. It should be closer to 100, right? But just take into consideration that on a good year, if half the country votes for the President of the United States, we like to say that turnout is high or higher than usual. So 84% of the people who are getting all these questions correct are voting. They're the ones who have political power. They're the ones who have the say. So now connect this back to these graphs that I'm showing you, right? If you're more knowledgeable, who is it going to be that there's a certain demographic that you're more likely to be, right? It's going to be the case that you are more likely to be more educated, right? That you've had a college degree. It's going to be the case that you're probably a male, that you're probably older, that you're probably white, and that you're probably rich. So it's not that it's just that people who are scoring 10 out of 10 are smart. It's that they're part of a certain segment of society who have held power in this country for a really long time. College educated men who are old, who are white, who are rich. And they're the ones who are making these choices for you because no one else is participating. And it's, in a lot of ways, it's not a decision, right? We're not making these choices consciously. We're not saying like we're not going to participate in politics. Demographically speaking, right, there's barriers, real barriers in the way. And the one way to think about this is income, right? So it's really hard for someone who makes less than $20,000 a year to stay plugged into politics. And why? Well, it's because you're just trying to live your life. You're trying to survive. And you might be working 12, 15 hours a day for real minimal wages to protect or support a family at home. So it's just that the day-to-day of someone who makes under $20,000 is real different than the day-to-day of someone who makes $100,000, and the interests are different in terms of what you want to protect as well, probably, or what you're trying to do with your time. But the implications of these are vast, right? And I think this is a really important point in this third section of the class, because you really want to kind of view political knowledge in the perspective of things that we've talked about, like oligarchy or even consumerism, right? This is part of the reason why corporations are so powerful, right? The people in this country who have money have control of our system. In the last part of the class, part 4, where I talk about representation, I'm going to kind of switch gears and not talk about this in such a pessimistic way or even a realistic way. Instead, I'm going to be more idealistic, and more idealistic in terms of how democracy was set up in this country. And this idea of our opinions and our hopes about politics and what they should be transferred to when we talk about politics. So public opinion starts with what you see on the screen in an election, right? The one way that we have a real say in American government is through voting for office holders. So people have opinions about politics. You can have opinions about political issues, right? You can have opinions about how government should be run. You can even have opinions about the specific candidates themselves. But what we do as citizens is that we take all of these opinions that we have and we tend to model them in office holders that we like. This is basically what an election is about. If I'm voting for president, I'm assessing, of this roster of 23 Democratic candidates running for the nomination for president, who of these 23 represents my opinion best. That's a really hard thing to do in a field of 23 candidates. But, that decision also comes in other forms. Who are you voting for president, Hillary or Donald Trump, right? So who of those two represents better my opinions about politics? So regardless of the choice, right, we're making these decisions all the time, but also for a lot of different offices. And that's kind of the first step of politics. In the next unit, we'll talk about elections and voting, how this works a little bit more in depth. But in terms of transforming our opinion, our opinions are kind of vested in our office holders. Our office holders kind of decide how much they want to follow their constituents. But ideally, what should happen in this process, once we elect these people to represent our opinions, these office holders then have a responsibility in government to transfer our opinions into policy. So these office holders have a lot of discretion. This is kind of what we talked about with Congress and the delegate and trustee models of representation. They can choose to follow what their constituency wants, or instead they can do what they think is best and ignore their constituents. But in this American government that the founders set up, in this representative government where we select people to legislate on our opinions, we would hope that office holders are taking a real close look at our opinions and transferring this into public policy. Now, there's a lot of different ways in which this kind of gets skewed, right? And I think in this video, what I'm trying to highlight at least is this system of transferring our opinions in people to office holders to policy or laws is really fundamentally skewed when our people don't know that much information about politics. And in that sense, we're real easily manipulated, right? We're manipulated by the people who hold office, the people who have power, the people who have money, corporations. So if these elites are manipulating the people to kind of think one way about their office holders, then maybe this policy that we're eventually getting in government is not really representative of our public opinion. So I kind of ended this video in a very different place than where I started, right? I talked in the beginning really basically about what is public opinion, and I talked about kind of the scientific ways that we should think about question wording and polls and random sampling, and now I'm kind of getting at the normative concerns about this, right? I don't ever want you to be so caught up in poll numbers. It's real easy to do this, especially in the rest of your lives. There are certain media organizations that make a lot of money off of these poll numbers. 538 is a real good example of this, but reputable institutions like the New York Times even do this as well, is that they focus on the horse race. And this is always going to be a consistent part of American politics because it sells. It's what makes these media organizations money. This is what people care about and tune into. However, what you should do is you should view these polls really skeptically because they're being manipulated, and they're being manipulated in really conscious ways where people are asking questions in very biased manner, but at the same time they're being manipulated because elites are manipulating our opinions and they're trying to dictate what we should believe as citizens. So there's a more normative side to this conversation behind public opinion, which deals with the realities of who knows what, who has power, right? These deficiencies in political knowledge. So it's a real interesting lecture, right? Because there's a real kind of practical side to public opinion, which is kind of the scientific aspects of having good polling. But then there's this real normative, kind of broader, loftier ideas about who really knows what's going on in politics and who doesn't.